Hey! So this may or may not be my third time recording this. See, the first time I decided that I didn't like my hair or my face or my cadence or my voice or my pacing or my angles.
That's what you said. And you know what? What was that? Okay, James.
Or the lighting, or really anything. So I re-recorded the entire video, and I was actually quite pleased with how the second time around came out. But then I realized that I forgot to turn my mic on.
Here we are, guys.
Anyway, welcome to a video written, starring, produced, edited, and catered by me, Alicia. And by catered, I mean we're doing wine and history time. You are more than welcome to partake. You can join me in that endeavor. No peer pressure, but maybe get some kind of a beverage or a snack because this is probably gonna get a little bit long. Anyway, I think we can all relate to the feeling of looking back on past fashions that we wore and just thinking like, why? For some, thinking about how we used to dress is utterly cringe-inducing and can bring up memories that we might as well just want to forget altogether. I'm not speaking from experience. I'm of course just speculating, and I cannot relate to that sentiment whatsoever.
Why?
Can you pretend you didn't see that? In this video essay, we're going to timeline jump to 19th century Britain to take a look at how the Victorians were kind of throwing shade at the feminine Regency dress of just a few decades prior, because I think it's interesting and maybe so will you. And let me tell you, they were not just cringing. No, they were outright condemning, criticizing, and censoring. Those might be the three genders. The dress of their mothers and grandmothers' time. Why the hostility? Well, we're going to chronologically explore various literary and visual representations to understand this intolerance as a projection of the strict social mores that sort of define the Victorian era itself. So the 19th century in Britain can, albeit simplistically, be defined into two distinct epochs. We have the Regency era and the Victorian era. So let's define those now.
It's definition time.
So the Regency era, i.e. Bridgerton and Jane Austen court, technically lasted between 1811 and 1820, during which Prince George, the future King George IV, acted as Prince Regent on his father, George III's behalf during one of his infamous bouts of madness. Of course, not my language, but that's what they called it. He was acting as regent on his behalf, hence the Regency era, quite aptly named. As far as fashion is concerned, Regency era and its associated terminology will not be strictly confined to Prince George's regency. Instead, we're going to consider what fashion historian Hilary Davidson calls the Long Regency. The Long Regency is the quarter-year time frame that embraced the Associated Empire silhouette from around 1795 to 1825. This period also overlapped with the First French Empire, which was 1808 to 1815, as well as the Napoleonic era in France, hence the Empire era, also quite aptly named. The Victorian era then describes the years between Queen Victoria's ascension to the throne in 1837 through to her death in 1901. Again, as far as fashion is concerned, we'll consider the years just before her debut and through to the rest of her reign. So backing up a bit, because I do want to provide a bit of historical context as to the Regency Empire silhouette and how it came to be. By the 1780s, they were really moving away from this exaggerated, very like slim, thick silhouette that kind of reigned supreme throughout the 18th century. The light and gauzy Empire silhouette was, in some respect, a manifestation of the political antithesis of the Enlightenment. Its more simplistic construction mirrored the egalitarian ideals that triumphed over the fall of the French monarchy and all its excess.
Let them eat cake.
The chemise dress that emerged at the late 18th century reflected the growing interest in classical antiquity. This neoclassicism craze followed the excavation of Pompeii, for example, and was starting to be reflected in the arts, like in architecture and portraiture, and of course in fashion. The French Revolution was really like the ultimate catalyst that incited all sorts of change, but again, that is a bit of an oversimplification because there were other things going on as well. So fashionable women are really feeling the ancient Greek and Roman vibes, emulating everything from the curly updos, the higher waistlines, the light draping fabrics, the shawls. They basically said copy paste. And this silhouette was a lot closer to the skin. It was way less structured. It was more tubular. Light cotton muslin, importantly, replaced printed French silk for the most part. This obsession with white came from the ancient Greek and Roman statues from which they would pull reference. However, this idea that the ancients were always dressed in white is kind of a funny misconception. In reality, the ancients clothed themselves in a variety of colors, just as people always have throughout all of time. I should mention the Greeks and Romans were not the only inspiration. Again, the Empire silhouette, which gets its name from the Empire of Napoleon, brought inspiration from across the globe. For example, paisley print in Indian shawls. The occupation in Egypt led to turbans being incorporated as evening wear. Appropriation, the classic byproduct of imperialism. This style was largely propagated and popularized by Empress Josephine in France, and she was very much a fashion icon in her own right. She was a proponent of neoclassicism in a big way. Paris at this time was still kind of the leading fashion capital, so British women would often emulate what they were doing in France, and the Regency fashion definitely follows that pattern. I know I said this video is about the Victorian condemnation of women's Regency dress, but I also have to mention that no doubt there were some contemporary anxieties over this silhouette, especially when it was, kind of first emerging. The neoclassical inspired look was a lot more dressed down than precedent, and it was certainly scandalized at the time. There are very famous satirical prints that kind of poke fun at the fashion, and I know all the fellow fashion historians are rolling their eyes, but not everyone knows about these, okay? Very briefly, Parisian ladies in their winter dress for 1800 depicts some fashionable ladies who are quite exposed and not at all prepared for the elements, and another being the Graces in a High Wind from 1810, which again just mocks the fashionable feminine silhouette and how revealing it was perceived to be. Obviously these are satire, they're not meant to be taken quite so literally, but there's a little truth to every joke, right? Because silly woman must conform to societal expectations, and yes, we will still make fun of you for doing so. There are pretty popular myths surrounding women's Regency fashion, such as the aptly named muslin disease, as well as the idea that they would actually dampen their dresses so to look like a Greek statue, which honestly goes hard.
Because it's iconic.
I mean, but they probably didn't do that. So I would be happy to do a video kind of debunking those myths as well as any other fashion history myths, so sound off and I will do it.
That is a threat, I will do it.
Despite being ridiculed for wearing more revealing clothing, they still would have worn the proper undergarments. That would have included a shift, stays, and petticoats. In colder weather, they would have worn heavier textiles like flannel, and of course the appropriate outerwear. There was no short supply of cloaks, hooded capes, redingotes, pelisses, gloves, hats, fur trim. Contrary to popular belief, our ancestors were not actually stupid. So yeah, people were hating on women's feminine Regency dress way before the Victorians, but as the 1810s progressed, the skirt got a lot less tubular and more structured, more angular. It looks even like trapezoidal at some points. The 1820s brought forth a more permanent interruption as they were moving away from neoclassicism and into Gothic or really dark romanticism, which focuses on human fallibility, self-destruction, judgment, punishment, and sin. So fun. This style and movement impacted all aspects of culture and society and was a rejection of 18th century Enlightenment ideals of logic and reason. So since the callback to classical antiquity was so wee baguette in nature, it's also worth considering that this growing sense of nationalism is also what motivated this transformation to this, very British Victorian silhouette. The shifting silhouette and philosophy seen in the
Who are you talking to right now?
The shifting silhouette and philosophy of the 1820s would lay the groundwork for the ultimate transition to the Victorian era. By Queen Victoria's 1837 ascension to the throne, a definitely more conservative and distinctly British silhouette had emerged that hid much of the body that had been on display for the better part of the early 19th century. This young beloved new queen was a massive proponent of this kind of rising social order, and her fashion certainly reflected that and influenced the masses. The fuller skirts and dropping waistlines of the feminine Victorian dress no longer emulated the liberated ideology of the past and instead reflected the domestic ideals of the present. I'm not going to get too into this shift that was happening during the Victorian era, but generally speaking, I think the term Victorian kind of conjures up ideas of conflict. For example, curiosity and control, repression and reform. The hasteness of social and economic developments led to equal excitement and anxiety. Along with these changes came a more strict moral code that favored sexual propriety, domesticity,
drink every time I can't pronounce that word,
and service. And naturally, criticisms of the recent past that were not so aligned with this paragon also emerged. As such, Regency-era customs and by extension fashion, especially concerned with women, seem to have been a crucial source of this aforementioned anxiety that the Victorians so desperately tried to alleviate. The Victorian Girl and Feminine Ideal by Deborah Gorham posits that having produced industrial capitalism, the Victorians sought refuge from it. Real, and its survival of the fittest values. The response was to define certain institutions in ways that would allay anxiety, and this paradigm was especially prevalent within the middle class and particularly concerned with women. The issue of women and their role in society was assuaged by a cult of domesticity. This confined women to the separate private sphere of the home, which was shielded from the masculine public sphere of business, politics, and professional life, and also the outdoors, apparently.
Just smell the grass, the dirt, just like I dreamed they'd be.
The angel of the house trope promoted the appropriate virtues under the shelter of her family's abode. This feminine moral ideal would naturally extend to physical representations as well. As such, the more conservative transformation of the feminine silhouette between the Regency period and Victorian era is so evidently a reflection of society's shifting attitude. To establish the complicated Victorian stance on Regency era conventions, one need not look farther than perhaps the Regency woman. Yes, I'm talking about Jane Austen herself. In Jane Austen and Representations of Regency England, Roger Sales provides insight into her own relatives' attempts to sort of transform Jane into a respectable lady by their own Victorian standards. They basically wanted to tone down her regenciness and make her like their Victorian poster child. These attempts to calm anxieties about her Regency associations and writing style are already evident in her brother Henry's 1818 biographical notice. This late Regency publication makes significant efforts to emphasize his sister's piety and domesticity. Concerns with her satirical writing style are assuaged by reassurances of their charm, polish, and finish. Later in the Victorian era, her nephew, the Reverend James Austen Edward Lee, is that his name? Nope. Later in the Victorian era, her nephew, the Reverend James Edward Austen Lee, that's his name, he would continue this family legacy of emphasizing such virtues in his more substantial and popular 1870 biographical notice, Memoir of Jane Austen. Careful omissions in his aunt's letters, especially those to her sister Cassandra, hide her rationality and playfulness, and work to suppress examples of what he deemed as Regency coarseness. Most notably, perhaps, he sort of confines her to her home, definitely echoing that angel of the house trope, potentially trying to spare her from the Regency world in which she lived. Deliberately, her sewing is praised and said to be almost as good as those produced by machines. I think it's pretty interesting because he takes kind of traditionally feminine industries such as spinning and posits them as having become a victim of industrialization. Again, like the anxiety was anxietying. This nostalgic perspective is definitely contrasted with his distaste for the Regency period's social conventions as a whole, especially with concern to women, which he communicates through his scrupulous censorship. The image of domestic perfection Jane Austen's male relatives present is largely at odds with her own writings and the range of her uncensored letters. Free her. The disapproval the Victorians felt towards perceived Regency impropriety also extended to literary representations set during the period. Similar efforts to distance even fictional characters from these undesirable features, which also clearly extend to women's fashion, are present in several very famous bodies of work. For instance, the Regency setting and fashion in Charlotte Bronte's 1847 Jane Eyre, as well as her 1849 Shirley, are shrouded in what appear to be intentional obscurity and perhaps even outright fabrication. I know you're probably thinking, like, Alicia, Jane Eyre is not set in the Regency era, it's set in the Victorian era. And I just want to say you're wrong. Sorry. This is like one of my Roman empires, so let me explain. I do want to say it is totally understandable why nearly every adaptation of Jane Eyre places the setting in Charlotte Bronte's 1840s or thereabouts. Unlike in Shirley, Bronte does not offer a really distinctive timeline for Jane Eyre. However, there is an established theory, and one I subscribe to personally, based on several compelling factors, that the novel is kind of like sneaky set in the Regency period. For one, when Jane is 18, there is mention of a portrait of the Prince of Wales, who, as you'll recall, served as Prince Regent for his father, George III, during one of his bouts of madness, again from 1811 to 1820. So it's reasonable to assume that this described portrait depicts the prince as an adult, because that would be extremely weird to have a portrait of just the prince as a child in your home. Like, they wouldn't do that. So being that he's an adult yet still referred to as prince, the year can be no later than 1820, after which he began his reign as King George IV until his death in 1830. Okay, stay with me. A year later, when Jane is at Morton, she receives a copy of the book Marmion, which was an actual genuine book. The publication date of Marmion is February 22nd, 1808. So I know Morton's a bit rural. Let's say the book didn't get there for a few years. Even so, this still corroborates the timeline offered by the Prince of Wales portrait, and certainly places Jane Eyre well before the commencement of the Victorian era in 1837. Indeed, Lucia Gray identifies that although Bronte subtly implies a Regency setting and timeline, she still does so from a moralizing Victorian perspective. Essential to this theory are the few sartorial descriptions of clothing in Jane Eyre, especially women's clothing. Bronte, in employing dress as an extension of identity, as one does, juxtaposes Jane's plain, sensible, working class, and very Victorian-esque clothing with those sumptuous, colorful, higher class Regency-esque styles worn by other female characters. It seems no mistake that any Regency implied fashion in Jane Eyre is always displayed on characters with aspects to which the Victorian in Bronte would have been opposed. Spoilers, but like, read Jane Eyre, okay? For instance, when describing Mr. Rochester's finely dressed guests, there is no mention of any distinctly Victorian signifiers. Instead, they appear in shawl turbans of gold-wrought Indian fabric, white muslin dresses with colorful sashes, pink and white satin robes, and white satin sandals. These conjure an image of women in sumptuous Empire-style dress, not Victorian. A few years earlier in the novel, which again counts because we're considering the long Regency, Jane watches her cousins descend to the drawing room dressed out in thin muslin frocks and scarlet sashes. Again, styles quite typical of feminine Regency dress. Correspondingly, Elaine Jane Arvin Andrews notes the stylish but precocious illegitimate child in Adèle Varenne, who, je peux pas le français, mais je manque de pratique maintenant. This child inherits her mother's passion for French dress and culture. This child's illegitimate status and connection to France is reflective of Victorian women's ambivalence towards French customs and fashion, especially Empire fashion as a whole. By contrast, Jane's character and therefore her clothing reflect the ideals that are more in favor with Victorian morality. Jane, except for at the very end of the novel, always appears in quite drab and plain clothing in either black, brown, or gray. There is, of course, also a class difference here, as Jane's classmates and teachers at the Lowood Academy also are habited in plainer colors and textiles, especially when compared to the aforementioned upper-class Regency adjacent characters. Even after accepting Mr. Rochester's marriage proposal, which would allow Jane to climb the social ladder significantly, her new fiancé offers to take her shopping, and Jane firmly rejects the rich and colorful satins and silks that he would like her to wear. Arvin Andrews says, instead of aspiring towards fashion, Jane creates her own version of it. Her Quaker-like gowns represent a sentiment of anti-fashion. By adopting a Quakerish Victorian dress, Jane emulates this rejection. Rather than ignoring fashion altogether, Jane constructs a parallel, if inverse, standard of taste. The idea of Jane's style being anti-fashion further places it in opposition to the fashionably current Regency styles. Jane is dignified, virtuous, and in every sense other than those other women who surround her. It seems that Bronte did want this story to take place in the Regency era, but again, from a very moralizing perspective. She avoided a conspicuous Regency timeline and correspondingly distances her heroine from from characteristics that she deems as more parallel to that setting. I think it's revealing then in Bronte's other novel I mentioned, 1849's Shirley, which does offer a distinctive Regency timeframe of 1811 to 1812. Bronte appears to anachronistically relocate the contemporary Regency fashions to an earlier period altogether. In one scene, the character Mrs. Pryor remembers visiting a neighbor 20 years prior. See what I did there? She says, I was very different to what I am now. My hair, my style of dress, attired in scanty drapery of white muslin, with bare arms, bracelets, and necklace of beads, and hair disposed in round Grecian curls above my forehead. Given Charlotte Bronte's indicated time frame of 1811 to 1812, this recollection would have placed Mrs. Pryor in the early 1790s, which, as you'll recall, takes place before even our long Regency era, which starts at about around 1795. Interestingly, though, the fashion she describes in this memory is far more akin to the story's present. See, the early 1790s were a very transitional period in women's fashion, and it had only just begun barely embracing characteristics that were later associated with the Regency era. The silhouette was still very closely resembling the previous decade. The current present-day fashions of 1811 to 1812 would have curiously included all of those described characteristics, like the Grecian curls, the bare arms, the beaded necklace, etc. Mrs. Pryor's language strongly separates her former image from that of her present, yet the indicated time frame chronologically disagrees. Consequently, Bronte willingly produced stories set within the Regency era, all the while ensuring that her upstanding female characters represent the morals and appearance of her Victorian present. Such measures necessitated aligning them to more contemporary dress and allocating Regency styles to less virtuous women or women of another time altogether. William Makepeace Thackeray's 1847 to 1848 Vanity Fair is another novel that employs this practice. So although the story commences in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, the setting is not properly reflected in the novel's illustrations. And by that, I mean in every single instance except for one, the female characters in the 1810s are depicted wearing contemporary 1840s style dress. Ruth M. McAdams views Vanity Fair as part of a shared Victorian project of using clothing to suggest the difficulties of representing the early 19th century. Despite Vanity Fair's perceived legacy of weak historicism, McAdams characterizes such historical confusion over dress as deliberately ambiguous. And I agree. And I will explain why. So when specifically examining the women in the illustrations, the clear absence of 1810s dress in place of 1840s contemporary dress suggests that Thackeray's intention may have indeed been explicit. Nearly all the women in the illustrations feature Victorian fashions, including natural waistlines, tight bodices, bonnets, and voluminous skirts. There is just one accurate visual representation of a woman in feminine Regency clothing. This is in the form of a vignette and shows a young woman in an empire waist dress with a long unstructured skirt and what appears to be a short-sleeved spencer. It's honestly unclear why Thackeray included this example at all, considering every other example of women's dress includes a very distinctive Victorian look. However, a footnote provides some insight into his thought process. He said, "It was the author's intention, faithful to history, to depict all the characters of this tale in their proper costume as they wore them at the commencement of the century. But when I remember the appearance of people those days, and then officer and lady were actually habited like this, I have not the heart to disfigure my heroes and heroines by costumes so hideous, and have, on the contrary, engaged a model of rank dressed according to the present fashion." George Henry Lewes and others have understood this passage as the author's delayed realization of his historically inaccurate sartorial representations. However, instead of admitting mistake, Thackeray admits his own biases, which further supports McAdams' theory of intentional ambiguity over genuine confusion. McAdams submits that the distinction between the historicity of the text and contemporaneity of the images is not as clear as it seems and is more uncertain in the case of the men than the women. Okay, so this distinction between the men and the women is especially noteworthy. Textual and illustrative depictions of men's dress in Vanity Fair do definitely veer on the side of ambiguity. And this should raise questions as to why the women's dress does not follow the same pattern. As indicated by Thackeray's own footnote, women's 1810s dress was deemed too unsuitable and actually prompted revision. His decision to outright replace feminine Regency dress with Victorian dress follows a Victorian effort to quell anxieties brought on by women's Regency dress through intentional censorship. Historical inaccuracy in this instance was a solution, not an oversight. As we progress in our timeline, we see more instances where the Victorians were outright conspicuous with their feelings towards women's Regency dress. A satirical cartoon from an 1857 issue of Harper's Weekly depicts two young women wearing bonnets, long-sleeved bodices, and full skirts, likely with crinolines underneath. And they view a painting of a woman in early 19th century dress. And although this cartoon originates from a New York-based political publication, it still echoes the same judgmental perspective shared by the Victorians in Britain, so we're gonna let it slide. The caption reads as follows: Arabella Maria, I love that he named them, only to think, Julia dear, that our mothers wore such ridiculous fashions as these. Both. Ha, 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 ha.
Ha 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 ha.
Why are some of those capitalized and others not? Like, I'm trying to decipher the cadence that was supposed to be communicated here, and I'm not quite sure. Ha ha, ha ha ha. Ha ha. So displayed in front of these two Victorian pick-me's is a Regency woman who appears practically salacious in comparison. I mean, she's got like her bare cleavage, arms, the Empire waistline emphasizes her bust, the thinner dress is clinging to her frame, and honestly, she's serving. We support Regency women in this house. The priggish Victorian women, by comparison, are completely covered up, save for their hands and faces. Certainly, it's important to recognize that this illustrator was also mocking the feminine silhouette of late 1850s Victorian women, implying that both appear ridiculous but for completely opposing reasons. The Victorian women dress too much, the Regency women dress too little. Nevertheless, the salient point here is the discomfort the modest Victorians felt towards Miss Regency. All right, down to our final two examples, both of which appear in 1868. The first is derived from the English Women's Domestic Magazine, which Megan Ward characterizes as combining the class aspirations of its readership with the cultural interest in the related virtues of domesticity and routine. So in distinguishing the defining aspects of late 1860s fashion, the magazine resorted to once again dragging the Regency silhouette. Keep her name out of your mouth. This was also written by a man, of course. The modern apon is fully puffed out at the back and sides. This fashion is not becoming to all figures, but what fashion ever was? And at any rate, it suits a far greater number of figures than did the Empire dress, which rendered them all without exception still and ungainly. From scant, ungraceful robes of the First Empire, we are rapidly going back to the more becoming fashions of Louis the... I know my Roman numerals. Louis the 16th and Louis the 15th. Things she did. That. So the writer is fine with praising French fashions that predated the Revolution, but his condemnation of Empire dress, so to endorse the current 1860s fashions, definitely complies with the trash can attitude of his contemporaries. I'm getting a little bit spicy, if you can't tell. Also produced in 1868 is the painting Before Waterloo by the historical genre painter Henry Nelson O'Neill. And this takes place in the same year as Thackeray's Vanity Fair and depicts the Duchess of Richmond's ball, which is also dramatized in Thackeray's novel. Although produced decades later than Vanity Fair, O'Neill too avoids accurately depicting women's fashion in 1815. He instead opts for a curious remix of Victorian era fashion that mostly incorporates elements from the 1830s. He's got jigget sleeves, full yet shorter skirts, the wide necklines, even the slightly higher waistlines are not quite up to 1815 standards and are much more indicative of the early Victorian silhouette. O'Neill, like his earlier Victorian predecessors, seems motivated by the moral constructs of his present. The artist chooses to depict a sartorially rich scene for the Napoleonic Wars, but is selective in his way of accuracy when it comes to women's fashion, even while depicting a real moment in history. Thankfully, such flawed representation could not last. A compelling trend towards the end of the century brought forth a sort of romanticization of the Regency era. I guess by the 1880s, the Regency was long enough ago to welcome a revisitation. Crucially, this trend was communicated through accurate descriptions and depictions of women's Regency dress. After decades of the ever-changing Victorian silhouette, with, restrictive corsets and cage crinolines and bustles, oh my. I think the once anxiety-inducing simplicity of the much more stripped-down Empire silhouette now inspired nostalgia for a period bygone. An early example of this wistful portrayal is John Petty's 1882 painting, Two Strings to Her Bow. This features a smiling woman in a very classic white muslin Empire-waisted Regency dress. She accurately dons accessories popular throughout the era, like a coral beaded necklace, blue and gold shawl, and even two dashing young men on either arm. Clearly, this differs greatly from its predecessors, making no attempt to shield the viewer from historicity. Petty instead kind of reintroduces agency to this Regency woman, honoring her through an accurate and detailed sartorial representation, and even giving her two hotties. Like, it is what she deserves. The rise of the artistic and subsequent aesthetic dress movements, although mostly associated with neo-medievalism, also engaged in women's Regency dress as well. As cited by dress historians Linda Martin, Elizabeth Ewing, and Claire Rose, the British children's book author and illustrator Kate Greenaway influenced a trend in reviving Regency styles for, and I quote, young Victorian girls. Her illustrations aesthetize the Empire era in idyllic sceneries, even inspiring a number of fashions sold at Liberties of London, one of the foremost purveyors of aesthetic textiles and dress for women and children in the last quarter of the 19th century. Her contemporary Walter Crane praised her treatment of quaint early 19th century costume, though touched with a conscious modern aestheticism that captivated the public in a remarkable way. In her chapter for Fashion Forward, Rebecca Perry suggests that Greenaway's influence reveals an attempt by Victorian mothers to mold their daughters into, and I once again quote, the properly aestheticized women of the future. I think it's pretty remarkable that this style, very recently considered too indecent for even adult women's eyes, ultimately became the choice for their promising young daughters and granddaughters. Like, why is that gonna make me emotional? As this revisiting of the Regency era continued, more historical genre painters such as Edmund Blair Leighton and Vittorio Reggianini, who produced some of the most deliciously sumptuous paintings of all time, and I'm once again complaining that almost all of his works are in like private collections. Free them. They captured a very romanticized version of Regency society through very playful and affectionate scenes between young men and ladies. These intimate moments are mainly communicated through gorgeously painted sumptuous attire, whereby the women's dress is like the main event, as it should be. I think it's no coincidence that women's Regency dress progressed from concealment to idealization at the end of the era. Indeed, the fin de siècle had much in common with the early 19th century. This shifting moral landscape invited what Michael Hefferman explains as a clear break with the past, defined by impassioned debates about the past, present, and the future on the eve of a new century. It appears that this newfound acceptance of progress also led to an appreciation of the past, which in turn led to an embracing of women's behavior and thereby their dress that once inspired censorship. Finally, women of the Regency era were being represented in a truthful way, the accurate representation of their clothing, both a celebration of their personal identity and histories.
Women's stories matter.
Yeah. Right.
They just matter.
Yeah.
Fashion, as we've hopefully established, is not just hemlines and fabric. It's an extension of identity, a reflection of societal values, and a powerful statement about who we are. As such, the Victorian rejection of women's Regency dress was not merely aesthetically motivated. The sheer volume of examples analyzed herein reflect a pattern of intolerance spanning at least half a century. I mean, what is it, like 1818 to 1868? The intentional avoidance of accurately depicting women's Regency fashion suggests a deeper connection to the moral conflict that defined the Victorian era itself. That is, until this societal shift that embraced a new perspective of the past in anticipation of the future, whereby denunciation of a recent heritage was replaced with nostalgia. I think it's a powerful reminder of how society evolves over time and how women and fashion play an integral role in that narrative. Oh my God, we did it! Oh, celebratory sips, because I'm not recording that again. Well, if you are still here with me, I just want to say thank you so much for sticking it out. I really appreciate the fact that you're here. I am so thankful for this growing community I have here on YouTube. This is something I've wanted to do for a very long time. And this will actually be my first full-length YouTube video. I've slowly been posting like shorts on here for, I think, a little over 6 months. And at the time of this video, I think I'm just nearing 70,000 subscribers. So thank you. Hopefully you liked this video. If you did, it would mean a lot if you liked and subscribed, maybe left a comment, like a respectful comment, obviously. Feel free to suggest any future topics. I definitely plan on doing more long-form fashion history kind of content. If anyone asks what I'm doing with my master's degree in fashion history, it's this. As of right now, it's this. As well as like vintage styling, etc. So if you're into that, stick around. I'd love to have you. Well, it is currently 9:04. That's pretty good. The last time I filmed this, I finished at 1:30 a.m. So what can I say? I'm growing, I'm improving. Thank you so much for being here. I'll hope to see you in the next one. And yeah, take care. Okay, bye. Human fallibility, what does that say? Destruction. Really?